And we're live.
This is Plant Daddy Podcast, serving you intersectional horticulture. I'm Matthew.
And I'm Steven. So today we are going to talk about how to grow carnivorous plants, and really geared toward the beginning grower or someone who's approaching carnivorous plants for the first time. This is sort of a follow-up of a previous episode where we talked about, my passion, sort of broadly. Here we're going to talk about more tactically how you can grow these yourself.
Well, because anybody can get started the same way that Steven and I did, which is you see a really cool plant that has a really interesting uniqueness to it. And we want to help you get started off in the best way because we both made mistakes with our first ones, but you don't have to.
Yes, I still have a tiny pig-shaped pot that I had my first one in. It's dusty, it's sentimental, I guess, but you should not do that, and other mistakes that we can cover that you can avoid.
Yeah.
Matthew, anything that you want to share, plant news-wise?
I haven't really seen a lot of plant news recently, but I did just order a few plants off of eBay.
Oh, okay.
And I'm pretty excited about two of them that I already have. One of them is Phalaenopsis pulchra. If you follow our Instagram, you already know about this because I posted this a couple of days ago and you won't be hearing this for a little while. But Phalaenopsis pulchra is a small species. It's native to the Philippines and it grows in hot, wet jungles. It is different from a lot of the ones that you see at the grocery store that we've talked about extensively. Those have all been hybridized to have large, round, kind of moon-shaped flowers, and they have tall, arching sprays of blossoms that are held really high up above the leaves. This one is quite small, though. The leaves on mine are only about 3 inches wide. The span, it's almost full-grown. And
Oh, wow.
yeah, its flowers are smaller by far. They're maybe like an inch or two across at the most. And they're kind of like a grape purple color. And they're fragrant. They don't have very many blossoms on each spike. But what makes it an interesting one to me is that it has a tendency that's unlike most other monopedial orchids, where it actually grows basal growth. So in our orchid episode, I talked about how if you damage the growth point of a monopedal orchid, that often kills it because that's where it grows from. And if it's damaged, then it won't grow anymore. This is a type, though, that will freely produce little baby plants from lower portions of its stem, which is pretty unusual for a Phalaenopsis. A second thing that it does to kind of increase the bulk of an individual plant is by growing what are called kiki. And these are basically little baby plants that it grows instead of flowers on a spike that it grows out. And these will tend to be longer than the ones that bloom. But the little baby plants that form will produce their own roots. They'll also bloom. They may produce their own kiki as well. So over time, you'll get a really beautiful specimen plant that's quite large, even though each of the individual plants are so small. And yeah, so I'm excited to try this. But what about you, Stephen?
Plant-wise, that thing I mentioned about 900 times, but I'm going to mention it again because the blooms are still around. It's the Brassivola nodosa.
It's my favorite orchid.
Yeah, so it's fully in bloom now. So at night it smells really, really pungent in a good way. Super
Pungent.
strong. Yeah, what's a good fragrant?
It's like,
That's a good
it's a
like
really
smell word
powerful
that's like
white floral.
yeah, you're right. It's not like a spicy scent. It's definitely, yeah, just kind of like a floral scent. It's nice though.
Yeah.
So that's blooming. I would say too, kind of pertinent to this episode, my fly traps that I have on my balcony are finally sort of big enough and robust enough that they're catching like bigger insects, which for them is kind of like when they're off to the races a little bit. So they're catching big meals and they'll grow large and then they'll probably flower and things like that. So I felt good about that. That just happened this week.
They look really good.
Yeah, even the one we had kind of a harsh winter last winter in Seattle, and I just kept them outside, which is not necessarily the best thing to do. But I was like, okay, if they survive this and they do, like I have some other plants. But yeah, they've fully bounced back and they're doing well, so that was cool.
Nice.
So, the topic at hand. Oh, Matthew, did you want to mention before where everyone can find us?
Yes, thank you. Before we dive into the topic, I just want to remind everybody that we can be found on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest as plantdaddypodcast.com. Um, and you can also reach us by email at plantdaddypodcast@gmail.com. So please be sure to rate and subscribe and tell your friends. We've already been getting some really thoughtful messages on Instagram from people kind of all over the place just saying that they had our show recommended and that they're really enjoying it. So thank you to everybody who's reached out. That's really nice to hear. But Stephen, can we go back to your topic?
Yes. Okay. So you want to try carnivorous plants, and maybe you never have, or you've tried them before and you weren't very successful. So we should go over kind of the most basic pieces. I think with carnivorous plants, there are just a few basic differences. Once you get those down, you can grow most of these pretty easily, or you can grow them long enough to then adjust based on what you see, in your home, or just do a little research to fine tune your care. So,
So if I'm looking to start out and I go to like some plant nursery, not even a very specialized one, but somewhere that sells carnivorous plants, what am I going to be the most likely to encounter?
So, from what I gather, and I've only really shot for carnivorous plants in the Northwest, right? So it might be a little bit different. It seems like there are different regional growers, right, and everything. But I would say you'll typically see Sarracenia species, so that's a North American pitcher plant. You'll typically see Venus flytraps, and I think more and more you're seeing different sundew species. We also see nepenthes as well in hanging baskets, I think more and more, but I think that probably deserves its own episode. Their care is a little bit different than the standard carnivorous plant. But I think those are the ones that you would typically see. And with fly traps in particular, you can see these everywhere.
You can even get them in little plastic cups at Safeway.
It's Safeway even? Oh,
I
wow.
mean, I've seen them there. They always look destined for death because they're way too dry and the growth is all
Yeah.
exfoliated.
Yeah, a lot of hobbyists call those death cubes, actually. It's like, so the fly traps come in death cubes, you're sort of put in a tough position right away. If you buy one in that, like maybe you think that it needs to stay in that or something crazy. Anyway, so I think you'll see those typically. And really, fly traps, I feel like you see those the most, right? Even at Walmart or something,
Yeah,
you can see
I
this.
in my own experience, I feel like the two that I see the most commonly are fly traps and death cubes, and also Sarracenia.
Yeah. So, and that matches my experience here in the Northwest too. So, just before we select a plant, I just want to kind of take one step back and talk about these key differences for carnivorous plant care. So, I'd say number one is the soil. 50-50 peat and perlite mix.
Do you measure that by volume or by weight?
This is by volume.
Okay.
Yeah, great question. So 50-50 peat perlite mix, that will set you up well for most carnivorous plants to start, really the vast majority. Even nepenthes that, you typically shouldn't grow like that, it would survive like that for a while at least or do okay in that soil. So that's, and you should pick peat and perlite that does not have anything added. Sometimes fertilizers can be added into these bags. Like if you get, you can buy Miracle Grow Perlite, for example. You should not buy that one. You should try to buy something organic, or, if you ask any, local carnivorous plant grower, if you just Google, some brand to kind of make sure there are no additives, I would do that. But then once you find a brand, you find a bag of peat and a bag of perlite, you just mix it 50-50. This can save you money and I would say worry as well, right? A lot of places will sell you carnivorous plant mix and the markup's kind of crazy. They'll sell you like some little bag, and that's fine at first, of course.
But I'd say that you have to go to like a really specialized shop like the Indoor Sun before you're going to find
You're
a
right.
pre-mixed carnivorous plant thing. So if you're just getting started and if you don't want to like invest in the space to get your own, chemical free, no fertilizer perlite and peat moss, that might be the way to go just to start out. And also just to see kind of what the texture of that is like so that you can start to mix that your own if this becomes something that you're really interested in doing more.
Yeah, and really, I think those soil elements that can help your growing kind of across your plant daddy hobby, I would say. Like if
Yeah.
you have peat or if you have perlite to make soils more airy, this is something that you're probably going to want anyway as you get going.
So I'm just going to touch on something really quickly that's
Hmm.
very off topic, but we're going to address this in a later episode. There's a lot of discussion right now among gardeners and like conservationists around the ecological impact of using peat moss in your
Yeah.
gardening. So
Yeah, broadly, it is complicated, like Matthew's saying. I know of a soil producer in the UK that grows and has like had his carnivorous plant collection in peat-free stuff for like decades. But I think in the US, as far as I know, that's pretty rare still. Okay, so you have the soil, 50-50 peat and perlite mix. Footnote here, you can also use coarse sand. I feel like for my experience, that's not quite as successful. Some of the plants that we're going to get to might prefer that slightly, but peat and perlite will work in really every case in my experience that peat and coarse sand will. But if you can't find perlite for some reason, or you can't find additive free perlite, then coarse sand might work, and not the tiny silica sand, but it would be I would suggest coarse sand. Anyway,
and if you're buying that at Home Depot in a large bag, I learned the hard way that playground sand is what you don't want. Like the stuff that's used for sandboxes and for leveling out your DIY balcony or deck construction
yeah,
and stuff.
construction stuff.
Yeah, like that is a small grained sand that's very fine. You want something that has a really coarse texture to it, like grittier than anything you would see on sandpaper.
Yeah. Okay. So we have the soil, peat and perlite. Next, keep them wet. Okay, and this is kind of hard for people. This is so different than so many plants, right?
Well, roots rot if they're kept
Yeah.
wet for the majority of houseplants.
But if you think about it, for these, often they sit in bogs. They sit in seeps, right, where water is constantly rushing over them. They're never dry. So for most carnivorous plants, or definitely the ones we're going to talk about today, you're going to have a pot and it's going to be sitting in water constantly, like water that you can see, like sitting in a puddle. And this is strange. This is a key difference, right?
But they're used to the water table being really high in their roots, so you have
Yeah,
to recreate that.
and these really are kind of bog plants. So keep them wet. And this is something that can have a surprising number of questions too, right? Like you're like, okay, keep them wet. Does that mean up to the leaves wet? The rule of thumb here is keep their feet wet. That's what people say. So you kind of keep their feet, right? So it's kind of like the bottom of the pot. There should be some. They should not be, submerged, right? They should not be full till like the middle of the leaf. But just to be super clear with this, most of them just like to have their feet wet. Okay. Next point, no fertilizers. We kind of touched on this before. You don't want Miracle Grow Perlite for these. A lot of these are used to these, nutrient poor environments. Their roots are burned if they're exposed to fertilizers at the levels that are normal for many other plants. And there are exceptions here, but generally as a rule, no fertilizers is the way to go, especially at the beginning.
Yeah, these are plants that grow in like peat bogs literally are known for how
Yeah.
little nutrition that they offer. There is nothing for a plant to use in a peat bog.
Yeah.
So it's important to make sure that you've respected that.
Okay, and another point, this is daunting sometimes. You have to use basically distilled water. So you can't have water with a high mineral content. In certain water tables in certain cities, this is easier than it is in others. But I think, again, we're talking about small plants here. This should not be scary, actually. You're talking about small plants. At most American grocery stores, a gallon of distilled water is 99 cents. That will actually last you a long time for a lot of these little, like a little cup that you might be keeping this in. So I would start there. We can kind of get into this later, like how you can, check the water that you have or what, alternatives you have. But this is something where you just kind of have to start with distilled, and they should sit in this water. Their feet should be wet with this type of water. Next, lots of light. So many of these plants will grow in full sun, in bogs without trees, right? Like nutrient poor environments. They're kind of used to being baked. So I'd say for Sarracenia, for fly traps, sundews as well, are from here, but They're kind of native to the southeast, right? So this is, you can kind of gauge the level of light from there. So in the northwest, we can give them full sun. That's no problem. I mean, maybe if you are, you know, in southern Texas, you might think about the light levels then. Like maybe your plants could get cooked a little bit. But in general, you're going to want to give these full sun, at least in sort of like, the typical North American scenarios.
Well, and especially if you're growing them inside, the very brightest light that you can provide is what they're
Yeah.
going to need.
Yeah. And I think this is something that kills a lot of fly traps or, yeah, I mean, maybe to a lesser extent, Sarracenia, but
That's how my first Sarracenia died when I
really,
was like 9 or something. I had a Sarracenia purpurata, purpurea,
Purpurea.
purpurea, and it was beautiful, dark red, purple pictures. And then I brought it home, put it in a north-facing windowsill, kept it wet, but then it just started growing like much larger traps that were green instead of purple. And it just kind of overextended itself
Yeah.
and didn't make it.
So yeah, just to sort of recap this, 50-50 peat and perlite soil, keep their feet wet, no fertilizers, distilled water, and as much light as possible. So, okay, this sounds like a lot of things, right? But then once you get in the motion of this, once this place in your home is carved out kind of for these plants, kind of all of them can work this way, or you can at least start here with pretty good success. Okay, so with plants, where should someone start? So as a first plant, I think we just touched on this. I would go for a Sarracenia, so a North American pitcher plant. I think Purpurea, kind of the shorter one. So Sarracenia purpurea, that's a great one to start with. That's the one that I started with that I think I've mentioned like 18 times in this podcast already.
It's a really nice, manageable size for a windowsill.
Exactly. It's a manageable size. This is something that you could even, start indoors too. And we can get to that. I wouldn't keep them indoors for the lifetime of the plant, but
That's true of all the Sarracenia, in my opinion.
yeah. So, but it's a great place to start because they have basically the same care requirements as fly traps, more or less, but they're much easier to feed than fly traps, which we'll get into. So for a pitcher plant, okay, you're going to put this in your 50-50 peat perlite. You can put this in some kind of tray, right? As long as its feet are wet and really stay wet. You can have it in a sunny window. And as far as feeding goes, you could put bugs that you find, right? Like this often happens in our homes, right?
But you don't want to find like a dead fly laying in a window track and put it in. I don't really know why, but I always hear that you should feed them with freshly killed insects.
I think that is best, but I would say with dead things, and at least with with pitcher plants, Sarracenia, I haven't found that there's an issue with it. It doesn't
Okay.
hurt them really,
Okay.
but it's probably not as good. Like maybe there's some kind of decomposition that's already happening, right?
Yeah. I mean, they are going to like decompose and rot away in the little stew that's inside of the trap anyway, so. Yeah.
So I think that's okay. But also if you don't have that around, and we don't all have homes like full of dead bugs. I mean,
Right
anyway.
now, I have a fruit fly problem that is out of control,
Yeah,
so.
we have seasons. Okay, no
Yeah.
judgment. But if you don't have those around, then you can feed fish food to these plants pretty easily. So I wouldn't just get any fish food. I know people do kind of like a Tetra fish flake. Apparently, I have not tried this myself, but
Interesting.
yeah, a much safer option is to get dried bloodworms. Sounds kind of
Oh.
gross, but you can get that at really any pet store. This is a fish food, or people feed their beta fish.
Yeah,
These
that's how I've used them.
and you're gonna buy one of these little vials for like $5. It's gonna last you years. Like they're
These aren't
really
very hungry.
nutritious. Yeah, and really these plants, you don't need to feed these daily. You don't need to feed these weekly.
If you
Okay.
do, you actually might kill that trap.
Yeah, I think you're gonna put something in there. You're gonna see how long it takes to decompose. It's not super fast, so
How
like
often would you feed like just a standard sized pitcher plant that you'd recently picked up? How often would you feed it?
so I think at most once a month.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean,
And
and
would you put like a little bit in each trap?
yeah, I would start with just putting one or two pieces and then see how the trap does. And it will kind of look like it will sort of, like absorb the water a little bit, like this insect or this, bloodworm, right? and then it will sort of liquefy slowly over time. And then if you put too much in there, it can burn the trap. If you're gonna know too, like if you put too much in there that it can't even be sort of absorbed by the water, right? That's in there. Like if it's heaping over that, that's definitely too much.
Pack the trap full of fish
Yeah,
food.
I would not do anything like that. And hey, as you get going, you can try different things, right? Like maybe you really want to try to get this to grow. Well, sure. And if that happens, typically you could just lose that trap. It's not going to kill the plant, which is nice.
Something that I've done with some of mine that I've been testing out different kinds of food is I might just put something in one trap and see how it
Yeah.
responds. Because, like, something that's really delicate and special to me, like my Helianthera, which we're not going to talk about now, but it's another trap type plant from South America. I'll put like one little thing that'll help it feed in one trap, wait a month or two to see how it does, and if that trap dies back, then I'll never use that food again. But typically, like, this is a good way to see how something will respond because they're fairly resistant even if that one trap dies back.
Yep, unless you try something really like some crazy systemic kind of chemically something. I think it is sort of used to situations in the wild where they'll drop one trap if something weird is going on with that. So you'll have a little bit of wiggle room.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I would say that's what I would do. I mean, dormancy is eventually going to be something you're going to have to do with these, but often if you get a small plant, you're not going to need to do that for the first year. If you don't have an outdoor space, this is a little bit harder to do. But even if you have an outdoor space, say in Texas, right, it may not get cold enough for these. There are different methods that people do to induce dormancy. So you could, put these in a fridge for a while. People do this for a month or two. Or maybe more. You should look it up specifically, kind of in your area to see what people do. Again, I would point you to maybe some local like Facebook groups. You could look at the ICPS website. That's the International Carnivorous Plant Society website. They have all sorts of grow guides. They would tell you what to do in, sort of non-temperate environments, but typically involves a fridge and you put it in there for a little while and just kind of, tell that Sarracenia that it's winter. But really, I think most places in the U.S., this isn't necessary.
And so I was just quickly looking up to make sure that I'm actually using like the right words, but I have found most of the Sarracenia are going to be hardy to like zone 7, zone 8. We're currently in zone 8B, which means that our minimum temperatures are 15 to 20 degrees. Zone 7A is 0 to 5. So your fridge is not going to get cold enough to do any damage to them because a refrigerator is going to hover like just above freezing, and all of these are completely fine to handle temperatures below freezing.
Yeah, and these are great, especially Sarracenia purpurea. This is a super hardy species that freezes solid. Like you look at the range of that plant, there are these kind of famous Sarracenia bogs in Ohio, really in some places that freeze for extended periods. So, if you're up north, this is a great option that you could just kind of put outside, right? If as long as you keep it wet, you can kind of set it and forget it a little bit. But yeah, I feel like this is the place to start. I know fly traps are everywhere, and hey, I started with a fly trap, so,
Didn't
but
we
I
all?
just, yeah, I'm
In
just
a
gonna
death cube.
try to urge you. I'm just urging you to not do that and find a pitcher plant instead. But okay, like our next topic, if you are gonna get a fly trap, all right, the good news, it's not that much more difficult. The more difficult part is feeding. Okay, so the care requirements, basically it's the same up until this food part. So we have 50-50 peat perlite, completely fine. Keep its feet wet, put it in the sun, sunniest place, put it outdoors if you can. This one, same kind of thing. It doesn't necessarily require a dormancy the first year, but it should have it after that. Okay, so any kind of fridge method or just put it outside, depending where you are. Just a side note, I think there are some people who say dormancy is not required. I have not tried that.
Something that I have heard, and I have kind of found this to maybe be a little true based on my experience, is that sure, a plant will grow indefinitely and continue to be happy, but they really require that dormancy period the way that we require sleep. Like, sure, you can continue to operate without sleeping, and a plant can continue to grow without dormancy, but over time it's just going to overexert itself and pretty sharply begin to decline once it is past a certain point.
Yeah, see, that's kind of what I would expect from these as well. And again, when you hear about the feeding part, I think you're going to want to give this a break. You're not going to want to be kind of responsible for feeding this thing when there are no bugs around and stuff like that.
I mean, you could go to the pet store and buy crickets.
Yeah, okay, Matthew can tell us about that part later. Okay, I have not done that.
It's
but
as
yes,
simple as going to the
I
pet
have,
store and buying
yes,
crickets.
I have considered this. Okay, the part for me is like, okay, you get a cricket, you take it home, then what? Like, where do you put that? In the bread drawer? Like, where's that going? The live
Not in the
crickets.
bread drawer. You have
Okay.
a special terrarium that is just for your crickets.
See, I knew there was
You can
something
listen to them
more.
chirp constantly.
Okay, so anyway, I would give these a dormancy. Okay, so we're at the same point with Sarracenia so far. Okay, but now that we want to feed them, this is where fly traps are more difficult. All right, you get one home. Your impulse is to like touch those little hairs you've heard about, right? To, make the trap close and how cool. I would not do that to your plant. This kind of uses their resources and, they're from these nutrient poor environments, right? Like plants can't move as much as they want.
Well, and this is a great way to see like rapid movement in plants, but
Yeah, it's
obviously,
amazing. It's their trick. Totally get the impulse to want to do that. And okay, you can do it like once or something, right? Like totally. But
yeah, but a
I
trap will
wouldn't,
only close what, like 3 times before it dies?
something like that.
Yeah.
I want to say what I used to hear is it will close twice without catching anything and then it will drop. And I don't think that's quite true, but it's something close to, it's like maybe three. So yeah, don't tease the trap every time you have a party or something, or I wouldn't like pass it around and have everyone close it, and then it's gonna be okay. Like it's gonna kind of stress your plant out, and like really by kind of stress your plant out, I mean it's gonna really stress it. So
Yeah.
yeah, I would not do that. So the feeding is complicated. Where for the pitcher plant, you're just dropping in some fish food, right? Like there's some water, there's some like fluid in there. It will just drop in. There's no movement. It will digest. For these, there's sort of this super intelligent, I think, like multi-step sort of checking process that the plant is doing. Okay, so you tease the trap, right? And I mean, you can see a zillion videos for this online, right? Okay, we're focused on care, but you know, you'll tease the trap, it'll close. The tough part is that, what I've heard is within like 45 minutes, another hair needs to be triggered in there, and that's where in this at this point the trap's already closed. But what the plant is doing is checking to make sure that this is not just like a twig, right? Or I think it's
Yeah.
like it's not some piece of debris that just fell in there. Like there's actually a living thing in here, like kind of trying to get out. Like it's making sure, hey, do I want to close down? Do I want to fill this trap with digestive fluid and do all the other resource intensive things to actually, get food out of this? Like, is there some nitrogen here, right? So if you just drop something dead in there, often, the vast majority of the time, the trap will just open up again thinking it was a false alarm. There are ways that you can try to get around this, but I've had maybe at best 50-50 kind of chance of success with this. What you can do if you don't have live food, you drop it in there, you kind of tease it, make sure it closes, and then they say to sort of gently like massage the trap over the next, half hour, like here and there. Okay, and listen, we're talking about beginning plants, easy plants. I don't think people want to sit and massage their fly traps a lot. Okay? And I mean
It's
even
like
if you
having
do
a
it,
dog.
yeah, and even if you do it, they don't necessarily believe it. So really, for these, I mean, they're so cool. They're so available everywhere, right? You kind of need to put them outdoors. You need to put them outdoors. You need to have, flies kind of, flying into these. And hey, most people have windows. You could do that. But I just think this is the reason why pitcher plants are easier. Anyway, so, all right, you're going to get a fly trap. Try to put it outside. You just kind of have to put it outside. Like that's how it's going to eat. Um, I have not had good results with different fertilizers on these. Like there are fertilizers people try to use on carnivorous plants that are a little bit different than many other plants. Like they use these urea-free fertilizers. There's ones called Maxi. I have tried spraying that, and it's not been kind to my plants. So I would just say yes, Venus flytrap. It's a good option if you have an outdoor space where it can catch food itself. Okay, so the next, you know, group of beginner carnivorous plants are sundews. I think sundews are great. And really, I think I would kind of put these at the top of the list, except I think they're not quite as prevalent as the other ones we've mentioned.
They're pretty common if you go to places that specialize in unique plants. So the indoor sun shop is usually where you'll find Drosera capensis for sure.
Yeah, here in Seattle.
Yeah, but they'll also have a couple of other interesting but easy kinds. This is actually the only carnivorous plant that I've ever seen in the wild. There's a hike, like way out there in Snohomish, where to get to the trailhead, you park and then like literally like crawl across logs through a bog to get to where the trail starts. And I like nearly pissed myself. I was so excited. I went on a hike with my mom a few years ago, and this bog was completely full of red sphagnum moss and these small little Drosera that were just marvelous to look at.
Yeah, and really these are so sort of like cosmopolitan, right, in their distribution around the world. You
They're
probably have
everywhere.
some near you. Is are some native species near you? Okay, so these, again, you kind of start with the same elements. You can do 50-50 peat and perlite. This is the one where people say you can do 50-50 peat and coarse sand instead, or that some prefer this. I have not noticed any great difference with this, but I have tried this before. Definitely works well, either one. Same kind of thing, keep their feet wet, and as much sun as possible. For these have little dewy leaves, right? That kind of have like a sticky fly trap happening. Often the leaves will curl over something that they catch. These are very easy to feed with dried bloodworms. I would actually add some water to the dried bloodworms to sort of like reanimate it a little bit, just to put it back, to put it on there, just because that sort of helps with the kind of higher humidity that these prefer. They don't need it though. I think some people really think that sundews need to be in bell jars or need coverage to kind of maintain that humidity. And I will say that that does help some of them, or it helps them look sort of more juicy and like dewy, but it's not necessary in my experience at different humidity levels.
Something that I have found is that growing them just unprotected indoors under lights, if my humidity drops below 40, the glistening dew just isn't there.
Okay.
But that's just my own personal experience. I think that if you're growing them in a dish of sitting water, though, that's a great way to just create humidity around them as long as they're semi protected from drafts and everything that would blow that humidity away. But for the most part, the way that they grow creates a lot of humidity around them anyway.
Yeah. But yeah, these are easy to feed. These, I think there's a lot of sort of growth and there's movement to these as well. You'll see the little kind of hairs on their leaves move and grab insects and wrap around them. And these are really beautiful how they glisten kind of in the light. I think, gosh, lately I've seen a lot of Drosera spatulata, which almost will look like a snowball kind of full of little plants. And you can buy these sometimes in the same place where you would buy like, you know, a little fly trap or a little Sarracenia pitcher plant, kind of, you know, in that same sort of selection, at least here in the Northwest. Like if a, you know, if a store will carry them, they'll kind of have these three types. But yeah, take these and give them a try. These would love to be outdoors as well. I think they would love, you know, they love a lot of light typically. And there's many, many species of sundews. But the ones commonly available, all of these conditions would work great, the ones that we've already touched on. Okay, so those are the three that I think you should start with. And, you know, the details about each of these, and hopefully those were helpful. What should you look for in a carnivorous plant in store? Okay, so you're there, you're going to pick one out. What makes a good one?
Well, it's not in a death cube.
Yes. Well, you probably get them in there. And really, those plants can be rescued. I don't want to, those should not be like never adopted or anything.
I am
But
just going to go ahead and say, though,
yeah,
that if you're brand new and if you're like, this is my first plant, just set yourself up for success and get something that's not going to need like
that's
critical
true.
care.
That's true. Yeah. So okay, you're right. If you adopt a death cube plant and it doesn't work, don't beat yourself up. That's important to say.
Yeah.
But I would say if you're picking one out, look for ones that are not sitting in bone dry soil. So, like I've been saying, kind of like ad nauseum, right? Keep their feet wet. Hopefully, the store knows to do this as well. And if they have been keeping it dry, you might have a little bit of rehab to do when you get home.
Now, I have found that if I am negligent and the sun is really hot and there's a little bit of wind and things are getting dry on my balcony, and if my Sarracenia do happen to get bone dry, they dramatically look withered, but you water them and they kind of pop back. So they're sort of resilient. Don't think that if you let it get bone dry, that your plant is lost.
Yeah, that's a good point. There will be some maybe in the soil, right? There'll be a little bit of moisture. And yeah, like it's, nature, right? Like shit happens and these plants are resilient.
They're pretty fucking tough.
So, but I would look for ones that are not kept in those conditions. All right, look for some soil that's wet. I would look for a new leaf or a new trap that's about to open. And this is kind of like other plants, right? Like maybe you're going to look for an orchid that has buds.
Yeah. Whenever I'm buying gardenias, I always make sure that there are a couple of open flowers, but lots of them that are developing. It shows you that they're in active growth and that they're at least like stable and happy enough to be actively growing.
And I think for carnivorous plants, this is good because it gives you a way to feed them, right? Or fertilize them. Like you'll get it home and you might drop, right? You might like have a trap kind of dry out or something like that. Of course, like there's going to be adjustments when you come to come to your home environment that might be different.
But that would also just happen like if the plant was growing in the wild. They'll do that occasionally, so it's not a
Yeah.
sign of negligent or insufficient care.
Yeah, and I would yeah, it's important to mention actually. I think for for many carnivorous plants, the leaves are very sort of like temporal or something, I would say. That's not the word I'm looking for, but your leaves are not going to last years. For a pitcher plant, that's possible actually. Like you could have a pitcher that hangs around for quite some time. But for sundews, you're not, you're going to have browning leaves, and that is utterly normal. It's going to keep growing new ones. They just don't last that long. So don't take that as a sign of, like, yeah, poor growing on your part or something.
If you were to see them in the wild, if you're familiar with how palm trees look in the wild, the leaves when they die don't fall away. There's like a
Yeah.
shaggy, dead, husky like column
Yeah.
of dead leaves below the fresh ones that cover the stalk. And there are quite a number of Drosera that will grow just like this, where they have a stem that is just like loaded up with fresh, dewy traps on the top, and then all of their dead brethren hanging out below. And we might try to like manicure that in our homes to keep them looking a little bit cleaner, but that's something that might be unexpected that you'll encounter and you shouldn't worry about.
But yeah, I would say, if you can find those two things, I mean, then it's kind of the typical stuff from there, right? Like, oh, is this plant full of bugs? Well, don't buy that, right? I mean, just kind of the normal
And
things.
when we say that, we mean like
Oh,
aphids.
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
The traps can be full of bugs. Okay, great.
If the plant is covered in bugs, that's
Yeah.
not good. If they're
The
full of
plant,
bugs,
yeah, the bugs
it's
shouldn't
healthy.
look happy. Okay,
Yeah,
they're
the
not.
bugs are not feasting on the plant.
No.
The plant is feasting on the
Yes.
bugs when ideal.
All right, so other recommendations for carnivorous plants, put them outside if at all possible. I think I've said that about 10 times in different ways now. Distilled water from the grocery store to start. You can then check your local water. You can ask other growers. And I would look for closed vessels, right? So, kind of touching on our decor focus that I hope we have on this podcast. Look for closed vessels that you like and put slip pots in there. I think there are a lot of growers who will just put soil directly in a closed pot. I think that's very hard to monitor the water level. I wouldn't start that way necessarily.
That's something that I've done, and we'll talk about that in a minute because I haven't had great success.
But yeah, look for, some closed vessels that you think are cool, ones that will fit these different slip pots in there. And then, fill the soil in that slip pot. Then you can take your plant in and out. You can, know how much water is sitting in there, etc.
You can also flush the pot by
Yeah.
running water through it, which removes
Yeah.
any buildup of minerals and salts, which I am pretty sure is how I kill all of my Drosera because I have grown them in like really beautiful decorative ceramic vessels that
Yeah,
have
they
no
look
holes in the
great.
bottom. Yeah, but they look great until like they just decide that their roots are done and the whole plant goes kaput.
Yeah. So, yeah, I would say that's how I would plant these. And really, I've gone to closed pots that don't have the slip pot, like planted directly in a closed pot, and I'm finding the same thing that you are, right? Like over time, I think the plant just seems less robust. I'm not sure if it's not getting as much water. Like often there are other plants that will grow in there with carnivorous plants, like bladderworts or utricularia. Those
Which
are
are also a carnivorous
piggybacking.
plant.
Yeah, they piggyback on a lot of plants that you might buy. And I think over time they can kind of overwhelm and maybe sort of constrict a pot. That's kind of a theory of mine, I guess. Like, so then maybe your plant is getting less water because they're sort of choking out the roots or something. Anyway,
It's being outcompeted.
yeah. So I think having that slip pot is best. Okay. So from here,
Well, can I ask a couple of questions?
yeah.
So, what are some of the common mistakes that people are going to make without knowing any better?
So I think what many people try to do is you just try to grow this like a plant that you need to keep on the wetter side, right? But really just have it sitting in water. Also have it baking in the sun. I think sometimes we'll read, well, baking in the sun. Okay. In the Northwest, bake it in the sun, right?
In
Okay, maybe
Arizona,
not in
please don't.
Arizona. Yes. But I would give it as much light as you can, and of course, yeah, if it starts to singe or something, then adjust accordingly. But yeah, I would not tease the traps, right, of your fly trap. I think that's a big one. I guess it's really ones that we've discussed kind of from here already.
Okay.
Any that you think I'm forgetting with
Uh,
those?
you know, I think that one of the biggest mistakes is just keeping the light high enough. Like that to me
Hmm.
is like just key. If you're gonna poke your Venus flytrap and kill traps, fine, it'll grow new ones, but that'll over time exert the plant and it'll stop being as robust. But if you don't give
Yeah.
it good light, it's going to dwindle and perish. So that's like the number one that I would have. But a question that I have actually had people wonder that has kind of made me laugh because I have my own experience with growing these. People wonder if the traps begin to smell because they're full of rotting insects.
Yeah, and
Have
this
you ever
is
found that?
actually no, and it's kind of fascinating. Like, so from what I read, right, like there are enzymatic things and there are these symbiotic relationships with, different microorganisms in there. But it's really remarkable. Like, I mean, Matthew's here in my home. There are kind of a lot of carnivorous plants in here. There's not a smell of any kind of decay.
I've never noticed
He's
anything
been
that I
polite
would.
enough to never
Yeah,
say anything. Like,
yeah.
no, this doesn't happen. If you put your like no, I mean, not that I've ever done this. I have. Like, if you smell them, like it smells kind of strange. Like if you put your mouth or your like nose up to a pitcher plant, say. I haven't noticed any smell, honestly. I have noticed a little smell if you're smelling like a Nepenthes, which we're not really covering this episode. They're probably going to be their own
They have their
episode.
own episode.
Like those, yes, but those are also kind of closed, so you really have to like,
You have to cram your nose up in there before you'll even detect a
yeah,
hint
which
of
is
a whiff.
embarrassing because I'm admitting I did that.
Well, so do they smell? There is something that I learned recently. Stephen alerted me to this. Some of the Sarracenia that are very tall and kind of trumpet shaped with white, Like, supposedly they have kind of a sweet rose-like fragrance that helps to attract flies. Um, Steven has one. We've both been like huffing on it like a paint can and can't tell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, we smelled it when it opened. I did more recently, but I will say that that one catches more pollinators than the other ones do.
So if you're worried
It
about
gets through.
pollinators, should you steer clear of these? I don't want my
Yeah,
traps full of honeybees.
actually, that's a great thing to bring up that we didn't really have, in our outline here. I would say I would not particularly worry about pollinators. Okay, it's one thing if you have your carnivorous plants right next to something that pollinators love, right? I would not do that personally. Like I don't have on my balcony, I have some carnivorous plants. They're not surrounded by flowering plants.
That's
Like I
true.
just think that's kind of not
As we've
what
mentioned
I
in
want
other
to do.
episodes, Steven doesn't know what ornamental appeal flowers have, so he
Yeah.
does not prize them.
Hopefully, in the course of this, Matthew will teach me.
I've been
Side
trying.
discussion.
He's got his Brassavola nodosa that's flowering. He's excited
Yeah,
about that.
yeah. So anything less than that, I won't have though.
Yeah.
I think you know most of these different plants they will mimic carrion smells. Not most of them, but some of them, or there's some that kind of they're more like animal waste kind of scents, and these are not strong smells,
This is
right?
on a
Like
level that
people,
an insect that is like
yeah,
designed to
exactly.
locate that will detect, but a human just walking by is like, that's a cool plant.
Yeah, these are ornamental plants everywhere. They do not all smell like, cat urine or something, which supposedly one of them does, but you really have to like get in there.
Yeah.
So these are not really things that are attracting honeybees, say. Some of them produce nectar, but again, these are
But
not really
flies
on
like
flowers.
that.
This is
Yeah.
mostly flies, yellow jackets. This year, I'm kind of surprised. I'm seeing more like paper wasps interact
Ooh.
with these, which was not.
Well, the paper wasps are probably looking to like bring dead protein sources
Or
back to
that's
feed to their
possible,
larvae or water.
or they're just sipping that nectar because I think the adults drink nectar, right?
Okay.
But yeah, I would not worry much about pollinators, which is good. Given that you're not putting this next to your exploding flower garden. I've not tried that, and I feel like they might kind of get confused if you did that.
So, and on my like secret garden balcony, I have several bowls of Sarracenia. They're growing in the sunniest corner that gets the most light. They are, less than 3 feet away from star jasmine or Triclospermum
Oh yeah,
jasminoides.
yeah.
That is the only plant on my balcony that actively attracts honeybees. And I keep a
Yeah.
close eye on what's in my traps just to kind of like see what's happening with my carnivorous plants. And I only find yellow jackets and houseflies.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, because I've never done that sort of next to it like that. And really, the plants themselves, they produce flowers, but the plants are kind of careful to, not kill their own pollinators, right?
Typically,
Often,
they bloom before the traps are really very active in the spring, and they hold them high up away from the traps themselves.
yeah,
That's true of a lot of carnivorous plants because it's really counterproductive to be
yeah,
trapping the things and killing
instantly
them.
killing them,
Yeah.
right?
You want them to be like able to move away
So,
from you when they're done getting your
yeah,
pollen.
so it's kind of an interesting sort of process to see too.
Yeah. So, what are things that we need to look out for individually? Because we've given some really good, like, robust growing instructions that cover many different types of easy to care for ones. But I'm interested about like the water quality, the water exposure, the sun exposure. Like, how are these things going to
Yeah.
vary if you're a little bit more curious on higher level?
Okay, so I would say for water quality, for the ones that we mentioned, it really should be distilled water or reverse osmosis water, something with relatively, like really very few minerals, if you can manage that.
Now, and Steven says this, but I only use tap water. Like,
Yeah,
I exclusively use tap water for my plants. Um,
in Seattle, we're lucky, right? We
I couldn't
have
get away with this in Hawaii, where their water is basically like mineral
like
with some
liquid
water on
mineral,
it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you may, like we were saying, you may have to get those 99 cents, like, gallon jugs, which should not. which should hopefully last you, right?
But that could also be contributing. This could be contributing to some of the problems that I've had in carnivorous plants is that I'm not using distilled water, and I'm just really happy with this success that I've had with ones that are hardy and resistant against it. And then
Hmm.
I'm mind boggled about like why my Drosera don't do well when I put them in enclosed pots and use like Seattle tap water.
Yeah. But on, as far as differences, I would say fly traps, they're not as cold hardy as the pitcher plants are generally. I would say for your sundews, I wouldn't really keep these outside. You really have to check on the species that you have, and many of these can't freeze as easily as the other ones can. I would say differences, like, all of these like humidity, but I feel like the pitcher plants, the Sarracenia, are okay with sort of the lowest humidity of these. You'll notice that with your sundews first, or you might notice your fly trap growing a little bit differently if it's in a super kind of dry environment, I guess. Like it might grow closer to the medium, kind of where there's more
Hmm.
humidity.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think very few individual differences for these.
Are there any that like want a higher water table and any that are going to start to dwindle if you keep the water really close to the crown?
At various times, I've thought this is a key difference. In my experience, if you kind of flood a pitcher plant, it doesn't seem to mind very much. At least the purpurea doesn't. And this is flooding, like assuming that it's going to go down right away. Fly traps seem kind of okay with that too. With the sundew, I feel like you should not bring this right up to like the leaves. That's one that I would drain right away. But I don't have like exhaustive evidence to prove that this is necessarily fatal here and not there.
Okay, so it's not like terribly
Yeah.
important. And then are any of them better for lower light conditions?
Great question. Gosh. You
We've
know,
mentioned this on other episodes, but the Darlingtonia, which
yeah.
is a West Coast pitchering plant, they're fine with that. And they also
Yeah.
don't want to get as hot as some of the ones that we've
Right. They
discussed. But
have kind of their own challenges, I would say. But you're right. If you have lower light and, like say you're in the Northwest and you have only a few hours or something
mhm.
like that, then Darlingtonia is a great option. And we can talk about those in more depth at some point.
But at least for the
Um,
ones that we're addressing on this episode, they're all pretty consistent with as much full sun as you can give them within reason.
yeah, and I really feel like if you have a bright windowsill most places, that will be fine. And it doesn't, it can be half a day. And I think of course, it's going to do better with a full day, but you're not looking at, death or something. I mean, the least light of these three, I would probably say
Are you going to say Drosera?
no.
Oh,
I
okay.
would probably say it's the pitcher plant and the fly trap, I think, would hang on longer than the sundew would
Oh,
for some
okay.
reason. I think, you're going to see them not grow as quickly, or they're going to be very green, or they're going to be, stretching, looking for light.
So
But
I hear you say they'll hang on longer, which, like, to me, I interpret that as it's not ideal. It will kill the plant, but you have a little bit more leeway before the decline
yeah, or,
becomes
it's like,
fatal.
oh, yeah, maybe it could work with that. And you just have to kind of see.
One of the best
Yeah.
ornamental qualities to these plants is how beautifully colorful and textured their leaves are,
Hmm.
at least with the Sarracenia, I mean. And it doesn't really do that under less than optimal light.
Yeah, there's a lot of really cool patterns and a lot of amazing hybrids that people make, with like reds, a lot of whites, interesting veining. There's like browns. Um,
There's a ton of
yeah.
really beautiful ones that you're not going to see at their best
Hmm.
unless your light is direct sun, which I think horticulturally it's pretty universal that full sun just means at least 6 hours of direct sun.
Okay, interesting. I didn't
Yeah,
know that.
at least that's kind of what it means for like if you grow peonies or orchids or something like that.
Yeah, but it's true for all these. You're going to see more interesting coloration if you give them more light. And there's like a lot of reds coming out in many of these.
Yeah. So,
Um,
I guess that the last thing I want to ask you are if you're brand new into this and you go to some cool plant place and find some carnivorous plants,
Hmm.
are there any that you think you should steer clear of before you're more confident and experienced?
So, of the ones we mentioned, you know, not really. I mean, there are some varieties of pitcher plant that are not super common that I maybe would avoid. Like, if you had, if there you see Sarracenia minor, say, those are ones that it seems like tend to need to be hotter to really do well. Those are the ones that are picky about, I mean, in my experience, like how their rhizome is planted. Like the rhizome has to be kind of half out of the ground or something, like when replanting comes. I mean, I don't think there's very typical cases where you would have to be like, oh no, I'm not ready for that. There are some others that we haven't mentioned yet, or maybe we'll get to in future episodes. Like I think there's certain Nepenthes where you would definitely want to be picky about what varieties you get. But
We're going to have a
again,
whole episode about Nepenthes
yeah,
because they're my favorite carnivorous plant. And there are like 18 species that I would want to have, but
yeah,
could not do unless I had a greenhouse.
yeah, or like a cold table or like some of the
Yeah.
setups that people have. But yeah, I would say for these ones that we've talked about, gosh, no, you're not going to see really difficult ones, I feel like. And then if you're looking for those difficult ones, then you probably know what to do.
Yeah, so it is worth mentioning that if you're listening to this and thinking like, okay, I'm going to go to a plant store, I'm going to look for a pitcher plant, but I have to avoid Sarracenia minor because Steven just
Yeah.
told me not to. Don't worry, you're not going to find
Yeah.
it. You're going to have to seek that plant out.
I
You're going to have
s-
to specifically look for it.
exactly. I think Indoor Sun Shop has that in Seattle, for example, but I don't know where else to go to get that. Honestly,
But
like I'd order it online, right? So this is not common.
from the most part, the Sarracenia that I have encountered in, you know, the selection of Swanson's, Ravenna Gardens, Sky Nursery,
Hmm.
Molbeck's, Flower
Yeah.
World, like all of these nurseries around the area that I love, they're mostly just hybrid Sarracenia or they're purpurata or purpurea. God, I keep making that mistake because one of my favorite orchids is Laelia purpurata,
Oh,
and so Sarracenia purpurea, like they're so close.
well, it's okay. You know what? You can save your strength to debate that with Miles. Okay, this is a safe zone right here.
I am going to
Okay.
go do one of
Any
those like anime
any
training
taxonomy.
montages where I go and like hang out with taxonomy books and like build up resilience.
Got it.
Yeah. Yeah, but basically like if you're going to find a plant easily at a price that you're going to want to buy for your very first one, it's probably going to be hard enough to tolerate whatever you're going to throw at it, given that you just followed Steven's parameters.
Yes. So, yeah, I urge you to try some of these. There's a lot of different ones. I think there's so many different hybrids, so many seed grown plants that you're going to get, something slightly different. They're cool, charismatic plants that do little tricks, I think. And I mean, you want a bug free home? This is a great way to start.
Well, it's a good way to start, but it's not going to solve all of your problems.
It's really not. Actually,
Yeah.
that's kind of a fallacy, too. I think people think this is going to
This is going to
catch
make my
everything.
home bug free.
Yeah, I mean, in reality, like one plant will kind of specialize in one sort of type of thing. Like, okay, if you have fungus gnats, all right, you can catch some with like a sundew, right? But they're
Well,
probably not gonna trigger a trap, like a fly trap.
yeah, so this is actually a good point that I want to just kind of close on. I grow a number of carnivorous plants for different reasons. The number one reason is their ornamental appeal. The second reason is that they're unique. The third reason is that some of them do well at some things. So I have some Pinicula that I'm sure we'll have our own episode dedicated to. We've talked about it enough that we're in love with these plants and want to talk more.
Yeah.
They do really well with fungus gnats. The sundews do really well with fruit flies. The
Hmm.
Sarracenia do really well with yellow jackets and like, you know, anything that's
Anything
larger
big, yeah.
housefly wise. Um, I don't really know if there's anything else that I would recommend if you're trying to target a specific thing.
Hmm.
The Venus flytraps outdoors are really productive, but indoors I've never had one catch anything.
Not really, yeah.
Yeah, so if you want to kill insects, invest in an electric fly swatter. Brian and I each have one, and this morning we went on a rampage killing fruit flies.
Wow.
But yeah, don't think that your carnivorous plant is going to make your home bug free. If you want to do that, buy some live bats, release some geckos, get a
Yes.
chameleon, let them all roam free.
Our official recommendation is live bats.
Yep.
Okay.
But get them from a clean source so that they don't have rabies.
Yeah.
So, anything else that you want to mention on this topic, Stephen?
No, I think that's it. Just want to encourage people to kind of get out there, get some, try some. You're going to make some mistakes, right? But there are more, plants in desperate need of home in death cubes right now.
Yeah.
So
So, if you have
if you
some success
try,
with a well grown plant from Swanson's
yep,
or Indoor Sun, go get a death cube and revive that poor little baby to make up for some other plant that you killed at some point in your life,
yes,
which we've all done.
the universe will thank you.
Yeah. So as usual, there is a Pinterest board at Plant Daddy Podcast, and it has many photos and growing instructions for all the carnivorous plants that we have discussed on today's episode. And I've broken it down by genus. So if you're interested in specifically the three that we focused on today, you'll have a lot of examples to look at. If you want to see some of the weirder, cooler ones, you'll find those boards too. Um, but yeah, anything else you want to add, Stephen?
That's about it.
All right. Well, this has been Plant Daddy Podcast. Thank you for listening. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. If you enjoy what you heard, please give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends. If you want to be in touch, email us at plantdaddypodcast@gmail.com or check out our social media, all of which can be found at Plant Daddy Podcast. We really appreciate the feedback that we've been getting so far. And if you write in and tell us about some topic that you're interested in,
Or a question.
yeah, oh my God, get in touch with us because Stephen and I love sitting here listening to the sound of our own voices, but we would really
Yes.
like it to be productive. So let us know if there's something you want to learn more about so that we can kind of focus an episode on something you want to hear about.
All right, looking forward to that.
Yeah, so we're looking forward to you tuning in next time. Thanks for listening and happy growing.
Thanks.